The ring was quiet. Two legends face to face, no smiles, no respect, and then Cody said one line that broke the internet. "It's funny what you remember. It's never the fireworks or the pyro. It's the silence." We came back from a commercial break, and there was no music, no grand entrance, just them. Roman Reigns and Cody Rhodes, standing in the center of the ring under the glare of 1,000 lights, but they seemed to be in a world of their own. The air in the arena was thick, heavy. The crowd, which had been a roaring sea of noise just moments before, was reduced to a confused, electric hum. They didn't know what they were looking at. This wasn't in the rundown. This wasn't a pose for the cameras. Roman's jaw was set. He wasn't the tribal chief in that moment. He was a man being stared through. And Cody wasn't the American nightmare. He was just watching, waiting. His expression wasn't one of aggression, but of profound, almost sorrowful understanding. You could feel it through the screen. Backstage, every monitor was frozen on that same image. Producers were silent in their headsets. The usual chatter and chaos of a live broadcast had evaporated. Everyone was holding their breath because we all sensed it at the same time. This was real. The space between those two men wasn't just a few feet of canvas. It was a canyon of unspoken history, of pressure, and of a truth about to break the surface. The quiet was the scariest part. The silence was a weapon, and Cody was letting it do its work. But the target wasn't the audience. It was Roman. For over 1,000 days, Roman had been encased in an armor of his own making. The head of the table, the tribal chief. An untouchable, almost mythical figure who spoke of legacy and bloodline as if they were divine truths. But in that silence, with Cody's unwavering gaze fixed on him, you could see the armor begin to corrode. It was in the subtle tick in his eye, the way his fingers, for just a split second, curled and uncurled at his side. He was searching for his script, his next line, his next perfectly delivered menacing phrase. But there was nothing. Cody was offering him nothing to work with. No taunts, no insults, no grandstanding, just presence. And that was more terrifying to a man like Roman than any physical threat. He wasn't just facing an opponent for his championship. He was facing a mirror that reflected not the titan he had become, but the man he once was, and perhaps the man he was afraid he had lost. The crowd's hum started to build into a murmur. They were feeling the discomfort, the raw, unfiltered tension. They began to understand that the performance had stopped. We were no longer watching a show. We were intruding on a reckoning. Finally, a stagehand slid a microphone into the ring. Cody picked it up, but he didn't raise it to his mouth. He just held it, the weight of it in his hand seeming to anchor him. He looked out past Roman, his eyes scanning the endless faces in the crowd, as if searching for a single person to bear witness. Then his gaze returned, locking onto Roman once more. He took a breath, a slow, deliberate inhale that drew every ounce of sound from the arena. The world was waiting for the promo, the grand challenge, the line that would sell the pay-per-view. Instead, what came out was a whisper, a quiet detonation that changed everything. He spoke, his voice calm, clear, and devoid of any manufactured passion. It was just honest. He said, "We both know this isn't about that belt anymore, is it, Joe?" And there it was. Joe. Not Roman, not the tribal chief. Joe, the name his family calls him, the name on his driver's license. In that single word, Cody didn't just break the fourth wall, he shattered it into a million pieces. He stripped away the character, the pageantry, the entire carefully constructed universe of WWE, and left a man standing in its place. He wasn't talking to a champion. He was talking to a person, and he had just done it in front of 15 million people. The reaction wasn't a cheer. It wasn't a boo. It was a gasp. A single, unified, sharp intake of breath from 20,000 people at once. It was the sound of collective shock. You could feel the air leave the building. On screen, Roman's face was a mask of stone, but you could see it. For a fraction of a second, the mask flickered. The tribal chief was gone, and Joe Anoa'i was there, exposed and caught in the headlights. His eyes, for just an instant, were not filled with rage, but with a deep, chilling confusion. It was the look of a man whose reality had just been ripped apart. Backstage, that's when the quiet broke, not into panic, but into frantic, hushed whispers. You could see Paul Heyman, a man who has seen everything in this business, look genuinely unnerved. His expression wasn't one of a performer. It was one of a friend watching something go terribly wrong. Producers were speaking into their headsets, their voices tight with uncertainty. Is this supposed to happen? Does anyone know about this line? But no one had an answer. The line had been crossed. The invisible boundary between the story we tell and the lives we lead had been erased, live on air. And nobody, not even the men in the ring, knew what came next. Roman tried to get it back. You have to give him that. He tried to pull the character back around himself like a shield. His own microphone was handed to him, and he raised it with that familiar, deliberate menace. He smirked, but it was a brittle thing, a gesture that didn't have the conviction it usually carried. He began his cadence, the low, rumbling speech pattern that had intimidated so many before. He spoke of his family, of the bloodline, of his duty as the head of the table. But the words were different this time. They sounded rehearsed, hollow. He was performing, but the audience had already seen behind the curtain. He wasn't addressing Cody Rhodes, the challenger. He was desperately trying to bury Joe Anoa'i, the man Cody had just summoned. There was a slight, almost imperceptible tremor in his voice, not of fear, but of strain. The strain of holding up a myth for so long, the pressure of being an idea, an icon, an unbeatable force for 3 years. In that moment, he wasn't a champion defending his title. He was a man defending his identity. And the desperation was palpable. He was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince the world that he was still in control, that the mask was still firmly in place. But we all saw it slipping. The tension became physical. It was no longer just in the air. It was in their bodies. Roman took a half step forward, closing the distance between them until they were almost chest to chest. The director made the right call, zooming in tight on their faces. You could see everything. The vein pulsing on the side of Roman's neck, the sweat beading on Cody's brow, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of the moment. This wasn't about a match at WrestleMania anymore. It was about right here, right now. It was about the ground they stood on and the invisible line that had just been crossed. And Cody didn't move. He didn't flinch, didn't back down. He just stood there, his expression a calm, knowing canvas. He almost looked sad for Roman. He understood what he had done. He knew the weight of that name. Joe. He hadn't said it to get a cheap pop or to start a brawl. He had said it to find the man. Because to finish his own story, he couldn't beat the myth. He had to beat the man. And in that suffocating proximity, with the world watching, he was finally face to face with him. The air crackled, and you just knew, something was about to give. And then it happened. Roman shoved him. It wasn't a wrestling shove, practiced and performed for a reaction. It was a real shove. An angry, frustrated, get-out-of-my-space shove. It was clumsy, unbalanced. It was human. The crowd, which had been in a state of stunned silence, finally exploded. That was the language they understood. The sound was a roar of pure, chaotic energy. They finally had their release, because now they knew for sure. This wasn't part of the show. This was an argument. This was a fight that had spilled out from behind closed doors and into the center of their world. Cody stumbled back, catching his balance on the ropes. But the look on his face wasn't anger. It was something closer to confirmation. Maybe even pity. He slowly straightened himself up, his eyes never leaving Roman's. He calmly bent down and picked up his microphone again. Around the ring, you could see the shift. Security personnel stood up straighter, their bodies tensing. They were no longer watching a performance. They were on duty, looking toward the gorilla position for a signal, for any instruction on what to do. But no instructions came. Everyone, from the fans in the cheap seats to the executives in the back, was frozen, utterly captivated by the sight of a king losing his composure. In that moment, the most telling part wasn't happening in the ring. It was happening backstage, around the monitors. Every superstar who wasn't in a match was there, glued to the screens. Seth Rollins, Kevin Owens, Sami Zayn. Their faces weren't the faces of performers watching a rival's segment. They were the faces of colleagues, of people who understood the grind, the pressure, the toll this life takes on you. There was a quiet, shared concern in their eyes. They knew Joe. They knew the immense weight he had been carrying, the impossible standard he had set for himself. They were watching a friend, a peer, come undone on the grandest stage imaginable. The silence in the gorilla position, where the show is run, was absolute. Vince McMahon, Triple H, Bruce Pritchard, the architects of this universe, were just watching. Their faces were unreadable. There was no screaming, no calling for cuts, no sending an agent to the ring to break it up. They knew what they had. This was something you couldn't script, something you couldn't produce. This was lightning in a bottle. This was the thin, sacred line where storytelling and reality bleed into one another to create a moment of pure, undeniable truth. And you don't stop it. You just let it burn. Cody raised the microphone and the arena fell silent once more. Everyone expected him to yell, to fire back, to escalate the fight that Roman had started. But that wasn't his goal. He never wanted a fight. He wanted the truth. He spoke, and his voice was as steady and clear as it was before, but now it was laced with a heavy, profound emotion. It was the sound of an ending. "I just wanted you to remember who you are, Joe," he said, his voice carrying through the silent arena. "Before all of this, before the title, before the bloodline, that's the man I have to beat, not the tribal chief." And with that, he let the microphone fall from his hand. The thud as it hit the canvas was like a gunshot, echoing in the stunned silence. It was over. He turned his back on Roman, a gesture of ultimate finality, and began the long walk up the ramp, not looking back. He left the tribal chief standing alone in the ring, the conqueror of everyone, now looking utterly and completely defeated. Surrounded by thousands of people, he had never seemed more isolated. The champion was alone with the man in the mirror. Cody's music finally hit, the familiar orchestral swell sounding harsh and intrusive, violently pulling everyone back into the semblance of a wrestling show. But it was too late. You can't unsee something like that. The director kept the camera tight on Roman's face as the show began to fade to black. He wasn't looking at the ramp where Cody had disappeared. He wasn't acknowledging the crowd. His eyes were distant, lost. He was looking inward at the conflict Cody had just laid bare for the world to see. That night, the performance ended. The carefully built facade of the invincible champion crumbled, and we saw the man underneath, drowning in the pressure of his own legend. It became a moment that fans would never forget, not for the physicality, but for the devastating quiet of it all. It was more than a confrontation. It was an intervention. It was a brutal, public reminder that even legends are human, and sometimes. The mask cracks,